Hello, good afternoon. Can anybody hear me and see my slides? So if possible, please let me know through the comment section of the interface. And as soon as I get some comments, I'm going to start in a moment. From now. So can anybody tell me whether slides end? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think we can start this session. So thank you very much for joining me. So the title of this presentation is There is More Than Words in Conversation. It is something that has already been implicitly discussed during this event in multiple presentations, but we're going to maybe going to dedicate a bit more of attention here. So essentially what we are going to see is how in a verbal or spoken exchange or in an interaction via a chat, we can go beyond words in order to better understand social and psychological phenomena. And to understand how we do, we start with a little game. So we can all see this picture in this moment, and you can pose yourself the question, what is happening there? What are they doing? Are they gently discussing? Are they exchanging ideas? And so on. You can take one moment to do that. And then another question is, what is the relationship between these two persons? Are they friends? Are they colleagues? Right? So you can take one moment to think about that. And in general, when we can do that interactively in presence, let's say the first question, roughly 60% of the people say that they are arguing, they are discussing quite heavily. Some people say that they are laughing, another 30%, and some people, 10%, tell me that they are singing together. And for what concerns the other question, the type of relationship, there is more consensus. 90% of the people tell me that they are a romantic couple, they are romantic partners, right? And even though different ideas, they tend in any case to say very close friends or member of the same family. Now, what is the interesting point of this? Technically, there is no right or wrong answer here, because all we have at disposition are a couple of silhouettes. We do not know who these people are. We do not know what they say. We can't see their faces. We cannot hear their voices. So how comes that we manage to be so confident about such a high-level interpretation of what happens there, such a high-level psychological and social information? Well, the point is that with our attention, we tend to focus pretty much on what people say, but there is a lot of nonverbal communication going on. And what you can see here are examples of what we call nonverbal behavioral cues. And we, as humans, are very much sensitive to these nonverbal cues. We sense them and we unconsciously interpret them in terms of social signals. So in terms of the relational attitude that people display to one another. Now, let's go a little bit deeper into this because it is central to this presentation. When we talk about nonverbal communication, we talk about mainly three elements. The first are the nonverbal cues that we've seen in the picture before. Then the second elements are the codes. So there are so many nonverbal behavioral cues that psychologists have grouped them into 5 major classes. The physical appearance, the way you look like, face and the behavior, so facial expression, but also movement like this, nodding, shaking, etc. Vocal behavior, which is everything in speech except words, so it's how you say things and what you say. Gestures and postures, and here by gesture I don't mean something like this, for example, that is much related to language, but more this type of spontaneous movements of hands when we speak. And space and environment. So space has a social meaning. We have seen before one of the reasons why everybody says that this is a romantic partner in the picture is because they are very close. And when you go to an organization, typically the more someone is important, the bigger the office. So space and environment have a social meaning. And then third important element are the functions, right? Nonverbal communication is a natural phenomenon. So it is there for a reason. And here you have some of the most important functions, at least according to psychologists. So form an impression. So most of you never saw me before. In this moment, I'm speaking in such a way that I'm trying to convey an impression of competence, of knowing what I'm talking about. Expression of emotion, right? No need of an explanation. When you are happy, you smile. If someone sees you smile, you will think that you are happy. Relational messages is exactly what we have seen in the picture before. It's the type of attitude we have: friendly, hostile, aggressive, etc. Deception management. So nature seems to consider important that we know how to lie and how to detect others lying. And finally, power and persuasion, right? So we need to know where we are on the social verticality dimension, and we have to adjust our behavior accordingly when we are with people that are below us and with people that are above us. Now, this is a very general and generic explanation about nonverbal communication. A psychologist can certainly do it much better than me. I am a technology person, and the point is exactly what has this to do with technology, and in particular with this event. Well, it has to do under two main respects. The first is what happens if we replace the person on the left with a machine, right? So the question here is, can we automatically generate, synthesize nonverbal behavioral cues that fulfill exactly the same function as the natural nonverbal behavioral cues? So is it possible for that robot or for a machine in general to look happy, sad, to have a certain type of attitude, etc.? And the second, the one we are going to focus on in this talk, is what happens if I replace the person on the right with a machine. So the technological questions here are, can I automatically detect nonverbal behavioral cues? And can I automatically interpret nonverbal behavioral cues in terms of the functions that are on the slide? So is that computer in condition to understand, for example, whether that person is happy or sad, whether it has a certain type of personality, what is its attitude, etc. Okay, and that is exactly what we are going to see. We are going to see in particular a few examples of the type of information that we can get out of this. And I'm going to give a little bit of a general idea of this, how can be done. Okay. So, for example, an interesting question that we can address by simply analyzing what people say and how they say is whether they are depressed or not. You see a very simple scheme there. We have essentially two streams at disposition. One is the speech signal, and that is where we really get information that goes beyond words. It's not what people say, but it is how they say it, right? We have the automatic transcription, which is what is the message that people are sending. They all enter into technologies which essentially do signal processing. So they extract from the data some numbers are representative of the shape of the signal. They do some machine learning, meaning that they try to map that information into an information of interest. And then essentially by combining the two, we can see whether someone is depressed or not. Do we manage to do it properly? Well, here you get what we obtain, right? If you only use paralanguage and language, so separately, you are around 72, 73% accuracy, which is quite good. If you combine the two of them probabilistically, you manage to go up to 85% accuracy, right? Which is quite impressive. Now, is that good? Is that bad? You can see these two horizontal red bands. This corresponds to the accuracies, according to the literature, the range of accuracies of general practitioners. And general practitioners are somewhat the first line of intervention against depression. So you can see that this automatic system defends itself quite well with respect to humans, the very first humans that somewhat detect depression. So imagine by doing this type of analysis to many call centers, to many services that where people speak, how many depressed we might detect that goes unnoticed simply because sometimes when you are depressed, you don't even really realize that you need a doctor. Okay. Another interesting question that we can pose to ourselves, okay, but when we speak, and we speak in our natural way, how do we sound? Meaning, what are people going to think about us depending on the way we speak, right? And this is a work that I did a few years ago in collaboration with a broadcast company. That somewhat was interesting to know how the journalists sound when people listen to them through the radio. So here is not even the content, because in this case, the content was so different, so changing that you cannot really use it. But if we go beyond, we go to paralanguage, we go to the way people speak, which means the very sound of the voice, how fast, the use of vocalization, pauses, sobbing, laughing, crying, etc. Right? If we try to analyze that, do we manage to see what are the personality traits that listeners tend to attribute to the speaker? And that is exactly what we try using a personality model known as the Big Five, right? And this is what we get. We somewhat managed to predict with the accuracy that you can see there, between 60 and 75%, more or less, whether someone is above median or not along those personality dimensions. And you can see in particular that two traits are recognized particularly well. One is conscientiousness, how smart someone sounds, and the other is extraversion, how nice someone sounds, right? So essentially what we managed to do is to predict how a voice that is going to be broadcast through the radio is going to be perceived by the listeners in terms of personality traits, which affects, of course, a large number of perception, because the nicer you think a person is, the more you will think that he's a good journalist or he's a good speaker on the radio, and so on. Right? Similar question we can do about ourselves. So in this case, it was about perception. How do we sound? What others are going to think about our own way of speaking, right? What do they think of us based on our speaking? But what do we leave about our own self-assessment of personality, which is in principle the true personality of an individual, right? Do we leak anything through our way of speaking? And what we did here, it was to consider individually what we call fillers, like this kind of etc., which is something that we do more frequently than how we think. It is something that happens more or less once every 30 seconds, unless you have trained and prepared to speak. And somewhat again, we collected automatically those little fragments of speech that account for somewhat typically our hesitation. We pass them through number crunching machines. So once again, extracting information from the signal and passing it through a machine learning approach to try to map it into information of interest. And once again, we try whether we could recognize what people think about themselves, or for what we consider traditionally to be the true personality traits of an individual. And once again, you can see it's a bit different than before. The performance is a little bit more uniform across the different traits. And that horizontal line is what we will get if we were simply flipping a coin, right? If we were simply using a random judgment. And you can see that here as well is interesting, because we don't really think about when we say etc. Actually, it's something that we do very spontaneously and very unconsciously. And still, through this type of approaches, we can get information about the personality of the individual, in particular about what the individual thinks about herself or himself. And then, let's say, an interesting thing that is happening now, everything I've been saying so far correspond to situation where we can use our own natural nonverbal communication. But something that is very interesting that is happening in this moment is that more and more interactions takes place via technology. And taking place via technology, we are not always in condition to actually use our nonverbal communication, what I describe in these slides. One case, for example, is when you interact via a chat interface. So the point here is, what does it happen when we interact through channels that do not allow us to use our natural nonverbal communication? Are we still in condition actually to convey information about ourselves via nonverbal communication? And that is what we try to do here by analyzing the way people type, so not what they type, not what they write, but the way they type, how fast, with how many deletions, with how much punctuation, with how much time they take to write a certain word, etc. Right? We try to see whether we can understand the personality traits of an individual, so what the individual thinks about himself or herself, by analyzing the way of typing, right? Same thing we did before with speech, we do it this time with the way of typing. And once again, these are the results that we get. The red line, as usual, corresponds to what we get by chance. And you can see that what is interesting in particular is that we collect quite well information about agreeableness, so how likable at the end is a person, how much that is a person that tends to do what other people like, and emotional stability, right, is the last chart. So how much a person tends to experience the positive side of life. So these were a few examples, and what I hope you can bring home as take-home messages is, first of all, that I convince you that social and psychological phenomena leave traces in terms of nonverbal behavioral cues. This is not an observation that comes from me. This is an observation that comes from psychology, right? But essentially, all the nonverbal communication is the trace that these phenomena leave. And this is interesting from our point of view of artificial intelligence, because detecting those nonverbal behavioral cues allow us to infer automatically social and psychological phenomena. Between humans, we do it in a very spontaneous way. That is how we understand how people around us feel. So we are basically trying to reproduce it in machine. And I gave a very few examples because the time is what it is, but you can basically extend this type of approaches to a wide spectrum of phenomena and modalities, right? And about this, I invite you to have a look at this particular website. It is the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in Social Intelligence Artificial Agents. It really revolves around this type of technologies. We are around 40 plus academics, all at the University of Glasgow. We are interdisciplinary, roughly half psychologists, half computer scientists, because we use psychology to do better computer science, and vice versa, artificial intelligence to do better psychology. We are training a total of 50 PhD students, which means, let's say, 200 years of work of 50 very bright students. So if you're looking for talent, that is a good place to do. And very important, 20 industrial partners that help us to shape our research according to the challenges in, let's say, industrial sectors that can be interested to this type of technologies. And you can see there the 4 areas that we analyze mainly, right? Principles and laws that govern interaction, analysis and synthesis of human behavior, and very important, what happens in the brain, because that is the source of everything. Behavior technology, like, for example, personal assistants that are an interface to wider infrastructure, and very important, ethics and social impact, because this technology will change our life. They are already changing our life, so very important to understand what their effects are. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to your questions. Thank you very much. I don't know if there is any questions. I guess you can put it in the interface through the chat or through the question answering functionality. So thank you very much. I think we have another minute or so, as far as I can see from the interface. And in case anybody's interested, feel free to contact me. I am at the University of Glasgow. And in particular, if you're interested also to partner with us, I see there is a question, how the typing can recognize a personality, if this also depends on keyboard. Yes, absolutely. Clearly, we did it on the normal keyboard, let's say on a laptop keyboard. But of course, it will be probably different in case of a mobile keyboard. But we still know that the type of keyboard is the most frequent. Right? And as far as I understand, this is probably one of the very last presentations, is not the last. So I hope you are all going to enjoy very much your stay in Edinburgh, if you are in person, or wherever you are, right? And I'm receiving a signal that we have to close the broadcast. So once again, thank you very much for your attention, and do not hesitate to contact me if I can be of any help. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.